The Gunslinger, Dark Tower Series, Book 1 by Stephen King. Part 14, narrated by The Laughing Ogre. Summer and hot. August had come to the land like a vampire lover, killing the land and the crops of the tenant farmers, turning the fields of the castle city white and sterile. In the west, some miles distant and near the borders that were the end of the civilized world, fighting had already begun. All reports were bad, and all of them paled before the heat that rested over this palace of the center. Cattle lolled empty-eyed in the pens of the stockyards. Pigs grunted listlessly, unmindful of knives whetted for the coming fall. People whined about taxes and conscription as they always have, but there was an emptiness beneath the apathetic passion play of politics. The center had frayed like a rag rug that had been washed and walked on and shaken and hung and dried. The lines and nets of mesh which held the last jewel at the breast of the world were unraveling. Things were not holding together. The earth drew its breath in the summer of the coming eclipse. The boy idled along the upper corridor of this stone palace which was his home, sensing these things, not understanding. He was also empty and dangerous. It had been 3 years since the hanging of the cook, who had always been able to find snacks for hungry boys, and he'd filled out. Now dressed only in faded denim pants, 14 years old, he had already come to the widened chest span and lengthening legs that would characterize his manhood. He was still unbedded, but 2 of the younger slatterns of a West Town merchant had cast eyes on him. He had felt the response and felt it more strongly now. Even in the coolness of the passage, he felt sweat on his body. Ahead were his mother's apartments, and he approached them incuriously, meaning only to pass them and go upward to the roof, where a thin breeze and the pleasure of his hand awaited. He had passed the door when a voice called him, "You boy!" It was Martin the enchanter. He was dressed with a suspicious, upsetting casualness. Black whipcord trousers almost as tight as leotards, and a white shirt open halfway down his chest. His hair was tousled. The boy looked at him silently. Come in! Don't stand in the hall! Your mother wants to speak to you." He was smiling with his mouth, but the lines of his face held a deeper, more sardonic humor. Beneath that, there was only coldness. But his mother did not seem to want to see him. She sat in a low-backed chair by the large window in the central parlor of her apartments, the one which overlooked the hot, blank stone of the central courtyard. She was dressed in a loose, informal gown and looked at the boy only once. A quick, glinting, rueful smile like autumn sun on stream water. During the rest of the interview, she studied her hands. He saw her seldom now, and the phantom of cradle songs had almost faded from his brain. But she was a beloved stranger. He felt an amphimorous fear and an uncoalesced hatred for Martin, his father's right-hand man, or was it the other way around, was born. And of course, there had already been some backstreet talk which he honestly thought he hadn't heard. "Are you well?" she asked him softly, studying her hands. Martin stood beside her, a heavy, disturbing hand near the juncture of her white shoulder and white neck. Smiling on them both, his brown eyes were dark to the point of blackness with smiling. "Yes," he said. "Your studies go well?" "I'm trying," he said. They both knew he was not flashingly intelligent like Cuthbert, or even quick like Jamie. He was a plodder and a bludgeoner. "And David?" She knew his affection for the hawk. The boy looked up at Martin, still smiling parentally down on all this. Past his prime. His mother seemed to wince. For a moment, Martin's face seemed to darken, his grip on her shoulder tightening. Then she looked out into the hot whiteness of the day, and all was as it had been. It's a charade, he thought, a game. Who's playing with whom? You have a scar on your forehead, Martin said, still smiling. Are you going to be a fighter like your father, or are you just slow? This time she did wince. Both, the boy said. He looked steadily at Martin and smiled painfully. Even in here, it was very hot. Martin stopped smiling abruptly. You can go to the roof now, boy. I believe you have business there. But Martin had misunderstood, underestimated. They'd been speaking in the low tongue, a parody of informality, but now the boy flashed into the high speech. My mother has not yet dismissed me, bondsman. Martin's face twisted as if quirt-lashed. The boy heard his mother's dreadful, woeful gasp. She spoke his name, but the painful smile remained intact on the boy's face, and he stepped forward. Will you give me a sign of fealty, bondsman? In the name of my father, whom you serve? Martin stared at him, rankly unbelieving. Go, Martin said gently. Go and find your hand. Smiling, the boy went. As he closed the door and went back down the way he came, he heard his mother's wail. It was a banshee sound. Then he heard Martin's laugh. The boy continued to smile as he went to his test. Jamie had come from the shop wives, and when he saw the boy crossing the exercise yard, he ran to tell Roland the latest gossips of bloodshed and revolt to the west. But he fell aside, the words all unspoken. They had known each other since the time of infancy, and as boys they had dared each other, cuffed each other, and made 1,000 explorations of the walls within which they'd both been birthed. The boy strode past him, staring without seeing, grinning his painful grin. He was walking toward Court's cottage, where the shades were drawn to ward off the savage afternoon heat. Court napped in the afternoon so he could enjoy his evening tomcat forays into the mazed and filthy brothels of the lower town to the fullest extent. Jamie knew in a flash of intuition, knew what was to come, and in his fear and ecstasy he was torn between following Roland and going after the others. Then his hypnotism broke, and he ran toward the main building screaming, Cuthbert! Alen! Thomas! His screams sounded puny and thin in the heat. They had known, all of them, in that invisible way boys have, that the boy would be the first of them to try the line. But this was too soon. The hideous grin on Roland's face galvanized him as no news of wars, revolts, and witchcrafts could have done. This was more than words from a toothless mouth given over fly-speckled heads of lettuce. Roland walked to the cottage of his teacher and kicked the door open. It slammed backwards, hit the plain rough plaster of the wall, and rebounded. He had never been here before. The entrance opened on an austere kitchen that was cool and brown. A table, 2 straight-back chairs, 2 cabinets, a faded linoleum floor tracked in black paths from the cooler set in the floor to the counter where knives hung to the table. A public man's privacy here. The last faded sobriety of a violent midnight carouser who had loved the boys of 3 generations roughly and made some of them into gunslingers. Court! He kicked the table, sending it across the room and into the counter. Knives from the wall rack fell in twinkling jackstraws. There was a thick stirring in the other room, a half-asleep clearing of the throat. The boy did not enter knowing it was sham, knowing that if Court had awakened immediately in the cottage's other room and stood with one glittering eye beside the door, waiting to break the intruder's unwary neck. "Court, I want you, bondsman!" Now he spoke the high speech, and Court swung the door open. He was dressed only in thin underwear shorts, a squat man with bow legs runneled with scars from top to toe, thick with twists of muscle. There was a round, bulging belly. The boy knew from experience that it was spring steel. The one good eye glared at him from the bashed and dented hairless head. The boy saluted formally. "Teach me no more, bondsman. Today I teach you." "You're early, Puler," he said casually, but he also spoke the high speech. 5 years early, I should judge. I will ask only once. Will you renege?" The boy only smiled his hideous, painful smile. For Court, who had seen that smile on a score of bloodied, scarlet-skied fields of honor and dishonor, it was answer enough. Perhaps the only answer he would have believed. "It's too bad," the teacher said absently. "You've been a most promising pupil. The best in 24 years, I should say. It would be sad to see you broken and set upon a blind path. But the world has moved on. Bad times are on horseback." The boy still did not speak, and would have been incapable of any coherent explanation had it been required. But for the first time, the awful smile softened a little. "Still, there is the line of blood," Court said somberly. "Revolt and witchcraft to the west, or no, I am your bondsman, boy, and I recognize your command and bow to it now, if never again, with my heart." And Court, who had cuffed him, kicked him, bled him, cursed him, made mock of him, and called him the very eye of syphilis, bent to one knee and bowed his head. The boy touched the leathery, vulnerable flesh of his neck with wonder. "Rise, bondsman, in love." Court stood slowly, and there might have been pain behind the impassive mask of his reamed features. "This is waste. Renege, boy, I break my own oath. Renege and wait." The boy said nothing. "Very well." Court's voice became dry and businesslike. 1 hour. And the weapon of your choice? "You will bring your stick?" "I always have." "How many sticks have been taken from you, Court?" Which was tantamount to asking how many boys have entered the square yard beyond the great hall and returned as gunslinger apprentices. "No stick will be taken from me today," Court said slowly. "I regret it. There's only the once, boy. The penalty for over-eagerness is the same as the penalty for unworthiness. Can you not wait?" The boy recalled Martin standing over him, tall as mountains. "No." "Very well. What weapon do you choose?" The boy said nothing. Court's smile showed a jagged ring of teeth. "Wise enough to begin. In an hour, you realize you will probably never see the others or your father or this place again." "I know what exile means," he said softly. "Go now." The boy went without looking back. The cellar of the barn was superiously cool, dank, smelling of cobwebs and earth water. It was lit from the ubiquitous sun, but felt none of the day's heat. The boy kept the hawk here, and the bird seemed comfortable enough. David was old now and no longer hunted the sky. His feathers had lost the radiant animal brightness of 3 years ago, but the eyes were still as piercing and motionless as ever. "You cannot friend a hawk," they said, "unless you are a hawk yourself, alone and only a sojourner in the land, without friends or the need of them. The hawk pays no coinage to morals. David was an old hawk now. The boy hoped, or was he too unimaginative to hope? Did he only know that he himself was a young one? "Hi," he said softly and extended his arm to the tethered perch. The hawk stepped under the boy's arm and stood motionless, unhooded. With his other hand, the boy reached into his pocket and fished out a bit of dried jerky. The hawk snapped it deftly from between his fingers and made it disappear. The boy began to stroke David very carefully. Court most probably would not have believed it if he'd seen it, but Court did not believe the boy's time had come either. "I think today you die," he said, continuing to stroke. "I think you'll be made sacrifice like all those little birds we trained you on. Do you remember? No, it doesn't matter. After today, I'm the hawk." David stood on his arms, silent and unblinking, indifferent to his life or death. "You are old," the boy said reflectively, "and perhaps not, my friend. Even a year ago, you would have had my eyes instead of that little string of meat. Isn't it so?" Court would laugh. "But if we get close enough, which is it, bird, age, or friendship?" David did not say. The boy hooded him and found the jesses which were looped at the end of David's perch. They left the barn. The yard behind the great hall was not really a yard at all, but only a green corridor whose walls were formed by tangled, thick-grown hedges. It had been used for the rite of coming of age since time out of mind, long before Court and his predecessor, who had died of a stab wound from an overzealous hand in this place. Many boys had left the corridor from the east end, where the teacher always entered, as men. The east end faced the great hall and all the civilization and intrigue of the lighted world. Many more had slunk away beaten and bloody from the west end, where the boys always entered as boys forever. The west end faced the mountains and the hut dwellers beyond that, and the tangled barbarian forests, and beyond that, the desert. The boy who became a man progressed from darkness and unlearning into light and responsibility. The boy who was beaten could only retreat forever and forever. The hallway was as smooth and green as a gaming field. It was exactly 50 yards long. Each end was usually clogged with tense spectators and relatives, for the ritual was usually forecast with great accuracy. 18 was the most common age. Those who had not made their tests by the age of 25 usually slipped into obscurity as freeholders, unable to face the brutal all-or-nothing fact of the field and the test. But on this day, there were none but Jamie, Cuthbert, and Ellen. And Thomas. They clustered at the boy's end, gape-mouthed, frankly terrified. "Your weapon, stupid! Your weapon!" Cuthbert hissed in agony. "You forgot your weapon!" "I have it," the boy said distantly. Dimly he wondered if the news of this had reached yet to the central buildings, to his mother, and Martin. His father was on a hunt, not due back for weeks. In this he felt a sense of shame, for he felt that in his father he would have found understanding, if not approval. "Has Court come?" "Court is here." The voice came from the far end of the corridor, and Court stepped into view, dressed in a short singlet. A heavy leather band encircled his forehead to keep the sweat from his eyes. He held an ironwood stick in one hand, sharp on one end, heavily blunted and spatulaed on the other. He began the litany which all of them, chosen by the blind blood of their fathers, had known since their early childhood, learned against the day when they would perchance become men. "Have you come here for a serious purpose, boy?" "I have come for a serious purpose, teacher." "Have you come as an outcast from your father's house?" "I have so come, teacher." and would remain outcast until he had bested Court. If Court bested him, he would remain outcast forever. "Have you come with your chosen weapon?" "I have so come, teacher." "What is your weapon?" This was the teacher's advantage, his chance to adjust his plan of battle to the sling, or the spear, or the net. "My weapon is David, teacher." Court halted only briefly. "So then, have you at me, boy?" "I do." "Be swift, then!" And Court advanced into the corridor, switching his pike from one hand to the other. The boys sighed flutteringly like birds as their counterparts stepped to meet him. "My weapon is David, teacher." Did Court remember? Had he fully understood? If so, perhaps it was all lost. It turned on surprise and on whatever stuff the hawk had left in him. Would he only sit disinterested on the boy's arm while Court struck him brainless with the ironwood? Or seek the high, hot sky? They drew close together, and the boy loosened the hawk's hood with nerveless fingers. It dropped to the green grass, and the boy halted in his tracks. He saw Court's eyes drop to the bird and widen with surprise and slow-dawning comprehension. "Now then." "At him!" the boy cried and raised his arm, and David flew like a silent brown bullet, stubby wings pumping once, twice, 3 times before crashing into Court's face, talons and beak searching. "Hail, Roland!" Cuthbert screamed deliriously. Court staggered backwards off balance. The ironwood staff rose and beat futilely at the air about his head. The hawk was an undulating, blurred bundle of feathers. The boy arrowed forward, his hand held out in a straight wedge, his elbow locked. Still, Court was almost too quick for him. The bird had covered 90% of his vision, but the ironwood came up again, spatula end forward, and Court cold-bloodedly performed the only action that could turn events at that point. He beat his own face 3 times, biceps flexing mercilessly. David fell away, broken and twisted. One wing flapped at the ground frantically. His cold predator's eyes stared fiercely into the teacher's bloody, streaming face. Court's bad eye now bulged blindly from its socket. The boy delivered a kick to Court's temple, connecting solidly. It should have ended it. His leg had been numbed by Court's only blow, but it still should have ended it. It did not. For a long moment, Court's face went slack, and then he lunged, grabbing for the boy's foot. The boy skipped back and tripped over his own feet. He went down a sprawl. He heard from far away the sound of Jamie's scream. Court was up, ready to fall on him and finish it. He had lost his advantage. For a moment they looked at each other, the teacher standing over the pupil with gouts of blood pouring from the left side of his face, the bad eye now closed except for a thin slit of white. There would be no brothels for Court this night. Something ripped jaggedly at the boy's hand. It was the hawk. David, tearing blindly, both wings were broken. It was incredible that he still lived. The boy grabbed him like a stone, unmindful of the jabbing, diving beak that was taking the flesh from his wrist in ribbons. As Court flew at him, all spread eagle, the boy threw the hawk upward. "Hail, David, kill!" Then Court blotted out the sun and came down atop of him. The bird was smashed between them, and the boy felt a callous thumb probe for the socket of his eye. He turned it at the same time, bringing up the slab of his thigh to block Court's crotch-seeking knee. His only hand flailed against the tree of Court's neck in 3 hard chops. It was like hitting ribbed stone. Then Court made a thick grunting, and his body shuddered. Faintly, the boy saw one hand flailing for the dropped stick, and with a jackknifing lunge, he kicked it out of reach. David had hooked one talon into Court's right ear. The other battered mercilessly at the teacher's cheek, making it a ruin. Warm blood splattered the boy's face, smelling of sheared copper. Court's fist struck the bird once, breaking its back. Again, and the neck snapped away at a crooked angle, and still the talon clutched. There was no ear now, only a red hole tunneled into the side of Court's skull. The third blow sent the bird flying, clearing Court's face. The boy brought the edge of his hand across the bridge of Court's nose, breaking the thin bone. Blood sprayed. Court's grasping, unseeing hand ripped at the boy's buttocks, and Roland rolled away blindly, finding Court's stick, rising to his knees. Court came to his own knees, grinning. His face was curtained with gore. The one-seeing eye rolled madly in its socket. The nose was smashed over at a haunted, leaning angle. Both cheeks hung in flaps. The boy held his stick like a baseball player waiting for the pitch. Court double fainted, then came directly at him. The boy was ready. The ironwood swung at a flat arc, striking Court's skull with a dull thudding noise. Court fell on his side, looking at the boy with a lazy, unseeing expression. A tiny trickle of spit came from his mouth. "Yield or die," the boy said. His mouth was filled with wet cotton. And Court smiled. Nearly all consciousness was gone, and he would remain tended in his cottage for a week afterward, wrapped in the blackness of coma, but now he held on with all the strength of his pitiless, shadowless life. "I yield, Gunslinger. I yield smiling." Court's clear eye closed. The gunslinger shook him gently, but with persistence. The others were around him now, their hands trembling to thump his back and hoist him on their shoulders, but they held back, afraid, sensing a new gulf. Yet it was not as strange as it could have been, because there'd always been a gulf with this one and the rest. Court's eye fluttered open again, weakly. "The key," the gunslinger said. "My birthright, teacher. I need it." His birthright was the guns. Not the heavy ones of his father, weighted with sandalwood, but guns all the same. Forbidden to all but a few. The ultimate, the final weapon. In the heavy vault under the barracks, where he by ancient law was now required to abide away from his mother's breast, hung his apprentice weapons, heavy, cumbersome things of steel and nickel. Yet they had seen his father through his apprenticeship, and his father now ruled, at least in name. "Is it so fearsome, then?" Court muttered, as if in his sleep. "So pressing. I feared so, and yet you won." "The key!" "The hawk. A fine ploy, a fine weapon. How long did it take you to train the bastard?" "I never trained David. I friended him. The key." "Under my belt, Gunslinger." The eye closed again. The gunslinger reached under Court's belt, feeling the heavy press of his belly, the huge muscles there now slack and asleep. The key was on a brass ring. He clutched it in his hand, restraining the mad urge to thrust it up to the sky in a salutation of victory. He got to his feet and was finally turning to the others when Court's hand fumbled for his foot. For a moment, the gunslinger feared some last attack and tensed, but Court only looked up at him and beckoned with one crusted finger. "I'm going to sleep now," Court whispered calmly. "Perhaps forever, I don't know. I teach you no more, Gunslinger. You have surpassed me, and 2 years younger than your father, who was the youngest. But let me counsel." "What?" Impatiently. "Wait." "Huh?" The word was startled out of him. "Let the world and the legend go before you. There are those who will carry both. His eyes flicked over the gunslinger's shoulder. Fools, perchance, let the word go before you. Let your shadow grow. Let it grow hair on its face. Let it become dark. He smiled grotesquely. Given time, words may even enchant an enchanter. Do you take my meaning, gunslinger? Yes. Will you take my last counsel? The gunslinger rocked back on his heels, a hunkered, thinking posture that foreshadowed the man. He looked at the sky. It was deepening, purpling. The heat of the day was failing, and the thunderheads in the west foretold rain. Lightning tines jabbed at the placid flank of the rising foothills miles distance. Beyond that, the mountains. Beyond that, the rising fountains of blood and unreason. He was tired into his bones and beyond. He looked back at Court. I will bury my hawk tonight, teacher, and later go into the lower town and inform those at the brothels that will wonder about you. Court's lips parted in a pained smile, and then he slept. The gunslinger got to his feet and turned to the others. Make a litter and take him to his house. Then bring a nurse. No, 2 nurses, okay? They still watched him, caught in a baited moment that was not able to be broken quite yet. They still looked for a corona of fire or a werewolf change of features. 2 nurses, the gunslinger repeated, then smiled. They smiled. You goddamn horse drover, Cuthbert suddenly yelled, grinning. You haven't left enough meat for the rest of us to pick off the bone. The world won't move on tomorrow, the gunslinger said, quoting the old adage with a smile. Alin, you butter-ass, move your freight. Alin set about to making the litter. Thomas and Jamie went together to the main hall in the infirmary. The gunslinger and Cuthbert looked at each other. They had always been the closest, or as close as they could be under the particular shades of their characters. There was a speculative, open light in Cuthbert's eyes, and the gunslinger controlled only with a great difficulty the need to tell him not to call for the test for a year, or even 18 months lest he go west. But they'd been through a great deal together, and the gunslinger did not feel he could risk it without an expression that might be taken for patronization. I've begun to scheme, he thought, and was a little dismayed. Then he thought of Martin, of his mother, and he smiled, a deceiver's smile at his friend. I am to be the first, he thought, knowing it for the first time, although he had thought of it in a bemused way many times before. I am to be the first. Let's go, he said. With pleasure, gunslinger. They left by the east end of the hedge-bordered corridor. Thomas and Jamie were returning with the nurses already. They looked like ghosts in their heavy white robes, crossed at the breast with red. Shall I help you with the hawk? Cuthbert asked. Yes, the gunslinger said. And later, when darkness had come and the rushing thunder showers with it, while huge phantom caissons rolled across the sky and lightning washed the crooked streets of the lower town in blue fire, while horses stood at hitching rails with their heads down and their tails drooping, the gunslinger took a woman and lay with her. It was quick and good. When it was over, they lay side by side without speaking. It began to hail, a brief rattling ferocity. Downstairs and far away, someone was playing Hey Jude ragtime. The gunslinger's mind turned reflectively inward. It was in that hail-splintered silence, just before sleep overtook him, that he first thought that he also might be the last. And we will pick up Roland at the brothel after his test of manhood in our next visit. Just thank you so much once again for joining us as we read The Gunslinger Dark Tower Series, Book 1 by Stephen King. This has been I'm going to leave this in there. This has been part 14, narrated by The Laughing Ogre. I'm leaving that in there because I did do the last, I don't know. I could look here and see. I did the last about 15, 20 minutes without cut, meaning that any little mistakes, I thought in my mind as I went that they weren't big enough to stop and redo. So one little slip there at the end, I'm not going to add another cut, and I'm not going to redo it. Thank you so much, constant viewer. See you in church.